The humid Brazilian afternoon clung to Dona Eliana's small house in Goiânia like a second skin. The air was thick with the sweet, heavy scent of ripening mangoes from the tree in the backyard and the distant, earthy smell of a coming rainstorm. Inside, the whirring of a lone ceiling fan did little more than push the heat around, its rhythmic click-click-click a metronome for the quiet, uneventful life she led. Eliana, at 78, moved through her familiar rooms with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who knew every creak in the floorboards and every shadow the sun would cast at 3 o'clock. Her hands, gnarled and spotted by time, traced the familiar contours of a hand-stitched tablecloth, her fingertips feeling the tiny, raised bumps of the embroidery, a sensation as known to her as her own heartbeat. This house was not just brick and mortar, it was the living, breathing archive of her life, of her late husband Armando's laughter, of their children's growth, a sacred space saturated with the ghostly aromas of 1,000 family meals and the echoes of 1,000,000 shared conversations. The front gate squealed on its rusted hinges, a sound that always announced a visitor. Eliana didn't need to look. The hurried, heavy-footed cadence of the steps on the gravel path belonged to only one person. Her nephew, Carlos. A sigh escaped her lips, not one of annoyance, but of a familiar, weary affection. Carlos was her brother's son, a boy she had helped raise after his father passed, a man who had always been a constant, if sometimes turbulent, presence in her life. Tia Eliana, his voice boomed, too loud for the quiet house, as he let himself in. The screen door slapped shut behind him with a familiar wooden thwack. He was a large man, his presence immediately filling the small living room, bringing with him the scent of cheap cologne and the outdoors. He kissed her cheek, his own damp with sweat. "How is my favorite aunt today?" "I am your only aunt, Carlos," she said, a small, tired smile playing on her lips. "And I am well. The heat is something else today, isn't it?" It is, he agreed, fanning himself with his hand. He never could just sit still. He paced the room, his eyes, as they often did, scanning the space with a calculating glint that made Eliana's skin prickle. "This old house, Tia. It's a burden for you. All the space, the upkeep. The roof, I was looking at it from outside, the tiles are looking weak." One good storm, he let the sentence hang in the air like a threat. This was a familiar song and dance. Carlos had been circling the topic of the house for over a year, ever since his latest business venture, a small trucking company, had hit one of its frequent rough patches. He always framed it as concern for her well-being, but Eliana could feel the avarice simmering just beneath the surface, a cold current in the warm familial sea. "The house is fine, Carlos. It has sheltered this family for 50 years. It will shelter me for a few more." Her voice was firm, but a tremor of unease had found its way into her hands, which she busied by straightening a stack of magazines. "Of course, Tia, of course," he said, his tone placating. He stopped his pacing and sat opposite her, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. His voice dropped into a conspiratorial whisper. "But you have to think of the future. The legalities. If something happens to you, a woman alone, the bureaucracy is a nightmare. You know I would never let anything bad happen to you, or to this house. It's our family's legacy." He let the word legacy resonate in the still air. It was a word he knew held power over her. She had watched him use it before, a velvet glove hiding an iron fist. "What are you saying, Carlos?" she asked, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. "I'm saying let me help you," he said, his eyes wide with feigned sincerity. "There's a new program, a way to get the title officially updated, to make everything modern and secure. To protect it from anyone who might try to take advantage. All you need to do is sign a few papers. I've taken care of everything. I have a friend at the Cartorio, the notary's office. He can expedite the whole process. For you, as a favor to me." The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls pressing in. The whirring of the fan was now a frantic buzz in her ears. She looked at Carlos, at the boy she had comforted after nightmares, now a man whose eyes held a desperate, hungry light. She felt a profound weariness, a desire to just have peace, to not fight anymore. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was too much for her. He was family, after all. Blood. "What papers?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He beamed, a quick, triumphant flash of white teeth, and pulled a folded document from his back pocket. The paper was crisp, official. "It's just a simple declaration. See? It says right here, it's for the regularization and protection of the asset. It's a standard form. You just sign here, at the bottom." He pointed to a line at the end of a dense block of small print. Eliana's eyes, tired and old, could not focus on the tiny words. They swam before her like ants on the page. She felt the weight of her age, of her trust, of her fear. She felt the ghost of Armando's hand on her shoulder, a memory so vivid it was almost a physical touch. What would he have done? "Carlos," she hesitated. "Tia, please," he implored, his voice cracking with what sounded like genuine emotion. "Do this for me. Let me take this worry from you. Let me protect our home." And in that moment of profound vulnerability, the desire to be free of the burden, to believe in the goodness of the child she had loved, won out over the quiet, nagging voice of caution. With a hand that shook only slightly, she took the pen he offered. It was cold and heavy in her grasp. She leaned over the paper, the scent of the ink sharp in her nostrils, and signed her name. Eliana Silva Oliveira. The letters flowed, a signature she had written 10,000 times, but this time it felt different, as if she were signing away a piece of her own soul. Carlos's relief was a palpable force. He exhaled a gust of air she hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you, Tia. You won't regret this. I will take care of everything now. You rest." He folded the document carefully, reverently, and tucked it back into his pocket. He kissed her cheek again, this time with a fervor that felt possessive, and then he was gone, his footsteps crunching away on the gravel, the squeal of the gate his final farewell. Silence returned to the house, but it was a different silence now. It was no longer peaceful, it was heavy, expectant, and cold. The familiar scent of mangoes now seemed cloying and sickly sweet. Eliana sat alone in her chair for a long time, listening to the fan click-click-click, and for the first time in 50 years, her home did not feel like her own. Weeks bled into months, and the seasons began their slow turn. The oppressive heat of summer gave way to the milder, drier days of autumn. But the change in the air outside did little to lift the chill that had settled in Eliana's heart. Carlos's visits became less frequent, and when he did come, they were short, businesslike. He no longer spoke of the house, of repairs, or of legacy. He talked about his expanding trucking business, about new contracts, about a future that seemed to be rapidly unfolding for him. He bought a new car, a shiny silver sedan that looked alien and arrogant parked in her humble driveway. The first true crack in the facade appeared on a Tuesday. A formal-looking letter arrived, something from the city's tax department. Eliana opened it with trembling fingers. It was a notice of a property tax bill, but it was made out to Carlos Alberto Silva. Confusion knitted her brow. This must be a mistake, she thought. A bureaucratic error. She called Carlos. "Oh, that, Tia," his voice was casual, almost dismissive, through the phone line. "Don't you worry about it. It's just because I'm handling all the paperwork now. It's simpler this way. I'll take care of the payment. You have nothing to worry about." His words were smooth, but they did not sit right in her stomach. They felt like a stone. A cold dread began to uncoil within her, slow and insidious. She started paying closer attention. She noticed the way he would refer to my house, in passing. She saw the new set of keys jangling on his keychain. The pieces were there, but her mind, loyal and trusting, refused to assemble the horrifying picture they formed. The breaking point came with a visit from her granddaughter, Luisa. Luisa was 25, sharp as a tack, with her grandfather Armando's keen eyes and her grandmother's fierce heart. She was the light of Eliana's life. She came bursting into the house one afternoon, her face flushed with anger and her eyes blazing. "Vô," she exclaimed, using the Portuguese term for grandma, her voice tight. "I saw Carlos at the shopping mall today. He was bragging to a friend. He said he finally got the house. That it was his now. What is he talking about?" The world tilted on its axis. The floor beneath Eliana's feet felt unsteady. The words, spoken aloud by someone else, made the terrible suspicion a concrete, crushing reality. The room seemed to lose all its color, all its warmth. The scent of the coffee Luisa had brought suddenly smelled like ash. He said it was for protection," Eliana whispered, her voice cracking. "He said it was just paperwork." Luisa's face fell, a mask of horror and pity. "Ah, Vô. What did you sign?" Together, they went through Eliana's small box of important documents. There was no copy of what she had signed. There was nothing. Just a void where the deed to her life should have been. Luisa, her hands shaking with rage, immediately started making calls. She called a lawyer friend. She called the notary's office, the cartorio, that Carlos had mentioned. The answers were evasive, unhelpful. It was as if a curtain had been drawn, and they were on the wrong side of it. The confrontation happened that very evening. Carlos arrived, summoned by a terse, furious phone call from Luisa. The moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere in the living room became a taut wire. The familiar space was now a battlefield. The soft glow of the table lamp cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to accuse. "What is this nonsense, Luisa?" Carlos began, his voice a low growl, his earlier casual demeanor gone, replaced by a defensive arrogance. "You stole from her," Luisa said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with pure, undiluted fury. She stood between her grandmother and Carlos, a petite but formidable shield. "You tricked her into signing over her house." Carlos's face hardened. "I did no such thing. Tia Eliana signed a document willingly." She wanted me to have the house, to manage it. She knows she can't handle it anymore. It was a gift. Eliana found her voice then, a small, broken sound that nonetheless carried the weight of a lifetime of trust betrayed. You lied to me, Carlos. You looked me in the eye and you called it protection. You called it our legacy. It is my legacy, he shouted, the mask finally slipping completely, revealing the raw, grasping man beneath. I've earned it. I've been the one here, dealing with her problems, listening to her stories. My father was her brother. I have more right to this place than you, he snarled at Luisa. You and your mother, you only show up for holidays. Where were you when the plumbing burst last year? Where were you? I was here. This house is mine by right of care. The argument exploded, voices crashing against the walls, accusations flying like shrapnel. Carlos's words were venomous, each one a deliberate strike to wound. Luisa's were scalpel-sharp, precise and cutting. And Eliana sat in her chair, a silent monument to grief, watching the family she loved tear itself apart in her own living room. The smell of Carlos's cologne was now nauseating, the sound of his voice a physical assault. She felt the foundation of her world, built not on concrete but on love and trust, crumble into dust around her. He left finally, slamming the screen door so hard the whole frame rattled. The silence he left behind was deafening, a void filled with the wreckage of their relationship. Eliana wept then, deep, shuddering sobs that seemed to come from the very core of her being. Luisa held her, her own tears falling into her grandmother's white hair. The house, their beloved sanctuary, now felt violated, its memories tainted by the poison of deceit. The days that followed were a blur of legal consultations and gathering storm clouds. The family was irrevocably split. Luisa and her mother, Isabella, Eliana's daughter, stood firmly with Eliana, their hearts burning with a cold, righteous anger. But other relatives, cousins and uncles, took Carlos's side, or worse, remained neutral, calling it a family dispute that they wanted no part of. The whispers and sideways glances at family gatherings, now fraught with tension, were almost as painful as the betrayal itself. The conflict was no longer a private grief, it had become public spectacle, a juicy piece of gossip that soured the very air. Their lawyer, a weary but kind-eyed man named Dr. Matos, laid out the grim reality. The document she signed, he explained, his voice calm and measured in the sterile quiet of his office, was a procuraco, a power of attorney, and a deed of sale. It was all bundled into one, written in such dense legalese that it's designed to be confusing. On paper, Dona Eliana, you gave Carlos the power to represent you, and then, in that same act, you sold him the house for a sum of money that, I see here, was listed as love and affection, a symbolic price. It is registered. The title is now in his name. Eliana felt the air leave her lungs. But I never received any money, she whispered. There was no sale. The law cares about what is on the document, not what was promised in the living room, Dr. Matos said gently. To challenge this, we would have to prove undue influence, or fraud. That is very difficult. It becomes your word against his. And he will say you were of sound mind, that you understood perfectly, that it was a gift from a grateful aunt to a devoted nephew. The burden of proof is on us. Hope was a distant, fading star. Luisa, however, refused to let it die. She became a woman possessed. She spent hours online, in library archives, on the phone, digging into property law, into the history of the cartorio. She was looking for anything, a loophole, a mistake, a thread she could pull. The stress was taking its toll. Dark circles bloomed under her eyes, and the vibrant young woman became pale and drawn. The smell of old books and cold coffee became her new constant companions. It was during one of these late-night research sessions, surrounded by a fortress of legal texts and printouts, that she stumbled upon a forgotten article from a local newspaper, digitized and buried in an online database. It was a small piece, from over a decade ago, about a scandal at the very same notary's office Carlos had used. The article mentioned an investigation into fraudulent registrations, and it named one of the officials who had been suspended. The name was the same as the friend Carlos had so casually mentioned. Eduardo Farias. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the thread. It was thin, almost invisible, but it was there. She didn't know what it meant yet, but it was a crack in Carlos's seemingly impregnable legal fortress. She immediately called Dr. Matos, her voice breathless with excitement. He was cautious, but intrigued. He agreed to look into it, to see if this Eduardo Farias was still connected to the cartorio and what, if any, procedures he had handled recently. The wait was agonizing. Carlos, emboldened by his legal victory, began to act more and more like the true owner. He started talking about renovations, about maybe selling the property to a developer who had made him an offer. He would come by unannounced, making notes, measuring walls, his very presence a violation. Each visit was a fresh wound for Eliana. The house was no longer a home, it was a gilded cage, its walls a constant reminder of her own naivete and the viper she had let inside. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, the phone rang. It was Dr. Matos. His voice, usually so measured, held a note of something Eliana had not heard in a long time: excitement. "Dona Eliana," he said. "I need you and Luisa to come to my office tomorrow. First thing in the morning. There has been a development." "What kind of development?" Eliana asked, her hand gripping the receiver so tightly her knuckles turned white. "It's about the original," Dr. Matos said, the words deliberate and heavy with meaning. "The original deed. The one from when you and your husband bought the land and built the house. The Cartorio, as part of a separate, internal audit, has presented it. And there is something about it, something Carlos's paperwork did not account for." Luisa, who was listening on the extension, felt a jolt of electricity run through her. "What is it?" she breathed. "It's better I show you," Dr. Matos replied. "Just be here. 9 o'clock. They arrived at the lawyer's office the next morning as the city was still shaking off the chill of the night. The air was clean and washed from the previous day's rain. Dr. Matos's office smelled of lemon-scented polish and old paper. He did not keep them waiting. On his large, mahogany desk, laid out with almost reverent care, were 2 documents. One was a modern, typed sheet, the deed that now bore Carlos's name. The other was a much older, yellowed piece of paper, its edges brittle, covered in elegant, faded handwriting. "De original escritura." Dr. Matos pointed a steady finger to a specific clause on the old document. "Look here," he said, his voice low and intense. "When you and Señor Armando purchased this land, 52 years ago, you had a specific clause written into the deed. A cláusula de inalienabilidad, an inalienability clause." Eliana's eyes, old and tired, could not make out the words. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice a fragile thread. Luisa leaned in, her eyes scanning the beautiful, cursive script. She read aloud, her voice gaining strength with every word. "It says, the herein described property, being the primary and sole residence of the purchasers, Armando Oliveira and Eliana Silva Oliveira, shall be held as a family asset, indispensable to the survival and unity of the family unit. As such, it cannot be sold, donated, or transferred in any manner, by either party individually, without the express, written, and notarized consent of the other, or in the event of their passing, without the unanimous consent of all living direct descendants." She looked up, her eyes wide, shimmering with unshed tears. You and Vovo, you protected the house. You made it so that one of you couldn't just sell it without the other. And after you were both gone, it would take all of the children agreeing to sell it." Dr. Matos nodded, a genuine smile finally breaking through his professional reserve. "Precisely. This clause is powerful and, crucially, it runs with the land. It binds all future owners. Carlos's deed, the one he tricked you into signing, is based on the premise that you, Dona Eliana, as the sole surviving owner, had the full, unencumbered right to sell the property. But this clause proves you did not. Not alone. You needed the consent of your late husband's estate, which in this case, means the consent of your daughter, Isabella. Did Isabella ever sign anything?" "No," Luisa exclaimed, a laugh of pure, unadulterated relief and joy bursting from her. "Never. She had no idea." "Then the sale is void," Dr. Matos stated simply. "It is as if it never happened. The Cartorio, in presenting this original document for their audit, has effectively invalidated the fraudulent registration. The title never legally transferred to Carlos. The house is still yours, Dona Eliana." Eliana did not cry. She did not shout. She simply reached out a trembling hand and laid her fingertips on the yellowed paper, on the faded ink where her husband's hand had once signed his name, right next to hers, a lifetime ago. She could almost feel the ghost of his touch, his love, his foresight, reaching across the decades to save her, to save their home. It was a wave of such profound, overwhelming emotion that it stole her breath. It was a validation, a resurrection. The weight that had been crushing her for months shattered and fell away. The final act was set in the same notary's office where the betrayal had been legally sanctified months before. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of dust and bureaucracy. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale, sickly glow on the tiled floor. Carlos was already there, standing with his own lawyer, a slick, impatient-looking man in an expensive suit. Carlos looked smug, confident, his arms crossed over his chest. He had expected a last-ditch, desperate negotiation. When Eliana entered, flanked by Luisa and Dr. Matos, his confidence flickered for just a second, seeing the grim determination on their faces. Isabella was there too, a solid, silent pillar of support, her hand resting protectively on her mother's back. The notary in charge, a different, older man than the one Carlos had bribed, was a severe-looking individual with wire-rimmed glasses. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Señor Silva, the notary began, his voice devoid of any warmth. We are here today to address the registration of the property located at Rua das Flores, number 425. This office has concluded its internal review of the transaction, prompted by the audit of our historical archives. Carlos shifted his weight. I don't understand what there is to review. The documents are in order. The title is in my name. The title was registered under your name based on a deed of sale signed by Dona Eliana Oliveira, the notary agreed, his tone flat. However, that registration failed to account for a restrictive covenant on the original title, a cláusula de inalienabilidade, which was never legally removed. Carlos's lawyer stepped forward. What clause? There was no mention of any such clause in the records we pulled. Because the records you pulled were incomplete, the notary stated, his eyes cold behind his glasses. He lifted the yellowed original document, holding it up for all to see. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. This is the foundational escritura. It clearly states that the property, being the family's sole and indispensable residence, cannot be sold or transferred by one owner without the express, written consent of the other, or their heirs. Dona Eliana, as the surviving spouse, could not legally sell this property without the consent of her daughter, Isabella Oliveira, as the representative of her late father's interest. Do you have a document bearing Señora Isabella's notarized signature, consenting to this sale? The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear the faint buzz of the lights, the ragged intake of Carlos's breath. His face had drained of all color, leaving a pale, waxy mask. His eyes darted from the notary to Eliana, to Luisa, and finally to Isabella, who met his gaze with a steady, unblinking stare of contempt. This is ridiculous. Carlos sputtered, his voice rising in pitch. That paper is 50 years old. It's obsolete. The law is not obsolete, Señor Silva, Dr. Matos said, his voice calm and firm. The clause is binding. The sale you engineered is null and void. The registration in your name will be cancelled, effective immediately. The word cancelled seemed to physically strike Carlos. He took a step back, his bravado crumbling into dust, revealing the small, desperate man underneath. All his plans, his boasts, his newfound wealth, all of it was evaporating in the cold, sterile air of the cartorio. He had played his hand, and he had lost. The house, the legacy he had coveted so fiercely, had been protected by the very past he had tried to erase. He looked at Eliana, and for a fleeting moment, she saw not the greedy monster, but the lost boy he had once been. The boy she had loved. But the moment passed, replaced by a bitter, impotent rage. You old, he began, but the words died in his throat under the collective, withering gaze of his family. He had nothing left. With a strangled sound of fury and defeat, he turned on his heel, his expensive shoes clicking sharply on the tile, and stormed out of the office, his lawyer scrambling after him. The slam of the heavy wooden door echoed like a gunshot, marking the end of the war. The ride home was silent, but it was a peaceful, healing silence. When they pulled up to the house on Rua das Flores, the late morning sun had broken through the clouds, bathing the whitewashed walls in a golden, forgiving light. The mango tree in the backyard glistened, its leaves still wet from the rain. The squeal of the gate as Eliana opened it was no longer a sound of dread, but a welcome home. She walked inside, her feet knowing every step. The house welcomed her back. It smelled of home, of her life, of safety. The whirring of the ceiling fan was no longer a frantic buzz, but a gentle, comforting hum. Luisa and Isabella followed her in, their presence filling the space with love and strength. Eliana went to her favorite chair and sat down. She ran her hand over the embroidered tablecloth, feeling the familiar bumps. She looked around at the walls that held her memories, at the windows that framed her world. It was over. The house was hers again. More than that, the family that mattered was here, in this room, bound not just by blood, but by loyalty and a shared fight for what was right. There would be scars, of course. The betrayal of Carlos would forever be a dark chapter in their family history. Some relationships were broken beyond repair. But as the 3 generations of women sat together in the quiet living room, the warmth of the sun streaming through the windows, a new chapter was beginning. It was a chapter built on the unshakable foundation of the past, fortified by the hard-won battles of the present, and filled with the quiet, resilient hope for the future. The conflict was finalizado, but the story of the family, and the house that held them, was far from over.